MKE600 is a shotgun microphone ideal for professional video camera applications. Maximal rejection of ambient side noises thanks to pronounced directivity. And because the MKE600 has a very good suppression of structure-borne noise, it makes one of the most versatile all-round shotgun microphones on the market. XS Wireless Digital is the perfect wireless audio solution for content creators and filmmakers. Thanks to a 2.4 GHz transmission, XS Wireless Digital is a truly plug-and-play system that allows you to upgrade your in-camera audio with one-button operation. With a variety of configurations to choose from, this entry point into the world of wireless will improve your workflow and will expand the possibilities of how you capture audio for your video. For more information, visit sennheiser.com/xswd. The MKE600 is a shotgun microphone ideal for professional video camera applications. Maximal rejection of ambient side noises thanks to pronounced directivity. And because the MKE600 has a very good suppression of structure-borne noise, it makes one of the most versatile all-round shotgun microphones on the market. XS Wireless Digital is the perfect wireless audio solution for content creators and filmmakers. Thanks to a 2.4 GHz transmission, XS Wireless Digital is a truly plug-and-play system that allows you to upgrade your in-camera audio with one-button operation. With a variety of configurations to choose from, this entry point into the world of wireless will improve your workflow and will expand the possibilities of how you capture audio for your video. For more information, visit sennheiser.com/xswd.
Okay, hello and welcome to Pro AV Live. I am joined by Alister Chapman and we are going to be talking about HDR. We're going to go over it in a little bit of detail, but I'm sure most of you already are vaguely at least familiar with the term HDR or high dynamic range video production. But we'll go over the basics and then take any questions that you may have out there because it's still a topic with a huge amount of confusion around it. But to start, welcome Alister. How are you today?
Yeah, I'm good. Hope everyone else is bearing up and raring to get back to work, etc.
Absolutely. Keeping sane, stuck indoors and safe. Right, so HDR. I mean, you've spent quite a lot of time over the last couple of years talking about HDR, haven't you?
Yeah, so I've been actually shooting and producing HDR content for about 5 years now. and it's something that's growing all the time. And in fact, I was having a conversation with somebody about some stuff in DaVinci Resolve just yesterday, and the workflow when you're using ACES, and I sort of brashly commented that, oh, it depends on which version of ACES you're using as to how the picture looks. And he came back and says, well, I've tried all the different versions and it all looks the same. And then, of course, I realized, you're doing it in SDR. And of course, in SDR, it doesn't make a difference. It's only in HDR that it makes a difference. And it's just so long since I've done an SDR only project. I don't remember the last SDR only project that I did, except for these sort of live streams.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
That's quite unusual.
Yes. I mean, everything that I've done, at least for the last year, has been HDR, or at least had the HDR version, often SDR as well, but always an HDR version, and always shot with HDR in mind.
What is the driving factor behind that, do you think? Is it because it's what your clients are asking for? Is it you future-proofing your work? Is it because that's what you want to be delivering right now?
It's because it's what my clients are asking for. But then that's kind of a market that I've generated for myself by having 5 years of experience of doing HDR.
Yes.
So people know that I can do it, deliver it, end-to-end workflow, all the way through to Dolby Masters, the whole works. So as a result of that, most of my clients are HDR clients. I think if that's just where I found myself. It's obviously not going to be the same for everybody. But having said that, now that YouTube are supporting HDR and etc., it's becoming normal to produce an HDR master.
We're getting far more devices that are capable of showing it right down at the consumer level, like iPads and stuff like that, and iPhones now able to show
tablets, computers. I recently upgraded my laptop to the new 16-inch MacBook Pro, and I was completely confused. I was playing back a clip that I knew was an HDR clip, and I'm looking at this clip on my laptop, and I'm used to seeing it being shown as an HDR clip, but on an SDR screen, so it looks wrong. And I'm watching this clip back on the MacBook Pro and thinking, hang on, is this the HDR? Because it looked right. And of course, then I realized that it's actually playing it back in HDR on the laptop.
Yeah, so, remarkable. So we're going to see an awful lot more production shift to at least having both versions, if not being HDR being the primary deliverable, I think, over the next maybe 2 years.
Every device now that you buy new, screens, TVs, phones, most of them, unless you're buying something very low cost, has some sort of HDR capability or functionality now. Whether you use it or not is another thing altogether. But the functionality is there now, and when it's done right, HDR looks. I think it is a big, significant improvement over SDR. So it's going to come. Whether it's 2 years, whether it's 5 years, is much harder to tell. But come it will. The tools are there now to do it so much easier than it was a couple of years ago. I mean, 2 years ago, it was actually quite difficult. Now it's so much easier. And YouTube now is, for me, I just do everything in HDR. I just create an H.265 file and upload it to YouTube, and it's no different really now to what my SDR workflow used to be, except it's HDR. So it's simple. So it asks the question, why not, really?
Yeah, there is absolutely that. Okay, so I'm keen for as much of it. I've called this the Q&A session because I'm keen for as much of this as possible to be driven by people's customers' questions. So I can see a couple of questions coming in already in the chat on YouTube or on Facebook. So if you have questions you want us to cover, or topics or particular things you might not be understanding you want us to just touch upon, absolutely leave them down below and we will get to them. While that starts to come in, though, I'll hold on these ones that are already there, and let's just do a brief introduction to the broad concept of HDR and some of the formats. Now, you've got how many pages is this PowerPoint presentation, Alister? It's nearly 100 pages, this PowerPoint presentation. You'll be pleased to hear we won't be going through every single one of them. We'll probably only do about 5. Let's bring this up, and you want to talk us through
Yes,
This
so
Alister?
as Carl says, this is just part of a much, much bigger presentation. This is something I'd probably deliver over a day or even 2 days if we were
Sure.
using all the slides. But just really, make sure everyone's on the right page here as to what HDR is, because there was, of course, or there still is, the photography HDR, which is something very different to what we're talking about now in the world of television and video. So high dynamic range, high dynamic range. Simple as that. It means capturing your scene with a high dynamic range and then also displaying it with a high dynamic range.
Yes.
So if you think about the way TV works now, generally, we've had these great cameras, FS7, F5, F55 from Sony, Arris, if you go back even further, Arri Alexa, etc., that for a very long time have been able to capture 14 stops or more of dynamic range.
Yeah.
And that is a high dynamic range. But until recently, all our TV sets, monitors, and screens could only show a low dynamic range. Rec 709 is only 5 or 6 stops. So we were always taking that big capture range, manipulating it with gamma curves and post-production grading, whatever, so that it looked nice on the TV at home. But the TV was only showing a very limited range. So what HDR is all about is about display devices that can now show a much greater dynamic range.
Yeah.
But one of the big considerations, though, is that actually standard dynamic range TVs aren't that bad.
No, they're pretty good.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, people weren't. I'm just looking for a chart that I thought I had handy, but there it is. Yep. So we've all seen these many, many times, I'm quite sure. Our charts, and obviously on here at the bottom we have black, and on here we have white. Now you're watching this via an online stream on your computer in standard dynamic range, and if I bring this chart up again, does the white look white to you and does the black look black? Well, I hope it does. If it doesn't, there's something going very, very wrong. But black to white. And that basically is our standard dynamic display range. And what's important about that is if I hold this back up again against my face, perhaps even like that, is that my face is darker than the white. And my face is actually somewhere around about sort of this grey bar here. And obviously on this chart, we have the skin tone patches as well. So my face is well within standard dynamic range. And in fact, with standard dynamic range, you have one more stop above this white patch here. And as you can see, if I catch the light on the black, we have highlights that are potentially just that little bit brighter. Now, at the moment, I'm reflecting one of the lights in my edit suite here back at the camera. And while you can see it's brighter than the white over here, it's not dazzlingly bright. But if I'm sitting here looking at that reflection with my own eyes, I can see that it's really bright. So that's what's lost with standard dynamic range. The mid-range, skin tones, black to white, plants, trees, bushes, houses, buildings, all of that stuff is exactly the same in standard dynamic range and high dynamic range. It's that same sort of first 5 or 6 stops. But it's the ability to take that highlight, there we go, and reproduce that, where has it got, that highlight there, so that instead of just being a little bit brighter than the white patch on this chart, it's dazzling, just as it would be in the real world. So if we go to the next slide in the PowerPoint slides, thank you, Carl. So a classic example is I go out and I shoot a thunderstorm and I shoot some lightning. And if we have the next slide. So in SDR, we've got the sort of the white of the clouds and the bolt of lightning. In standard dynamic range, we can't show that bolt of lightning significantly brighter than the white of the clouds because we only have this limited highlight range. And then if we go to the next slide, in the HDR world, and of course this is just an illustration,
this is just simulated.
A greater dynamic range, the lightning bolt can be shown much brighter than white, and as a result it looks far more realistic. So the things that tend to work and show up most in HDR are reflections off water, highlights, sparkly bits and dazzling things. And it's actually generally only a very small part of the image overall. HDR is not about an image that is overall bright and dazzling. That wouldn't be natural. If I was to make my skin tones twice as bright as they are right now on the screen that you're looking at them right now, it would look really weird because faces aren't that bright. So it's actually about things like the highlights, perhaps where the light's catching my forehead, being more realistic. So with 709 standard dynamic range, you have a highlight roll off. So right now, the camera that I'm shooting with here is an FS5, in fact, is rolling off these highlights to make them look or look okay in 709. But what that tends to do is make them look very flat, and they don't tend to look real or natural. They very often get a plasticky look to them. But in a high dynamic range environment, you'd be allowed to make those highlights bright and shiny, and it would look far, far more true to life. So it's not really changing the whole image. It's just giving us this ability to show the highlights in a much, much more realistic way. Another example would be, and this is where HDR can actually work against you, is if you were shooting an interview with somebody against a window or against a bright sky.
Well, yeah, and if I open this blind behind me, for example.
Yeah, so in an HDR world, what's outside of that window could be shown as being very, very bright. You'd be able to see the trees, you'd be able to see all the stuff outside the window as per the real life. But what then happens, of course, is because that part of the shot becomes so bright, is that the foreground appears to be darker because you've increased your contrast. And then you get the same as happens in the real world. If you're looking at somebody and they're standing against a window, it's not something that's nice to look at. Yeah. So HDR can be your friend because it can make it look more realistic, but you also have to work within reasonable limitations because the shot still has to be pleasant to look at.
And so hearing colorists talking about HDR, what I've always found fascinating, and was a real turning point for me when I was learning about HDR for the first time, was the real understanding that it's not just a either or. It's not a click button on and boom, you've got HDR. It's in exactly the same way as you would grade a Rec. 709 image. You would decide how black the blacks were. You would decide where to put the whites and all the bits in between, and where the color goes and all the rest of it through power windows, etc. All that same stuff still happens in the HDR world. They can choose, is that window behind me at this nit level or this nit level or this nit level? It's just that they've got these brighter values to all of a sudden be playing with. So that if they don't want that to be too distracting, they can dial it back. If they want it to be overbearing, that the outside is shining through, they can dial it right up.
Yeah, you can, but you have to be a little bit careful when you do that. So you still want your artistic intent in there. You still need to have that artistic view of the image. But more and more now, one of the workflows that's becoming much more common with HDR is to use the Dolby workflow. So you do a grade in a format called HDR10, and then you pass that through a Dolby analysis pass. And what that does is it analyzes the levels in every shot, and it basically creates a set of metadata for the video that allows the video to be converted on the fly to standard dynamic range. So the whole beauty of this Dolby workflow is that you can produce a single master, which is an HDR master, and then from that you're able to also have a standard dynamic range version, in fact a hybrid log gamma version, and all sorts of different versions without actually having to transcode anything. And for that to work, you do have to stay within reasonable boundaries for certain things. So, for example, your skin tones need to be around that sort of 70, 80 nit range, because if they go over 100 nits, the Dolby down conversion tends to treat them as highlights, and it does nasty things to them.
Yeah.
So you've got to, if that's your workflow, and it's something you need to be aware of, because Dolby, I think really now they've really got that very, very well sorted, and now more and more of the TVs have it built in, is something that will be used more and more because it's a brilliant system.
Yeah, it sort of follows the same very broad concepts of something like HLG does, doesn't it? Where they want one deliverable to be shown on a variety of different devices and scaled without the creator having to create several different things, but they do it in a very different way.
Yeah, I wouldn't agree with that, because HLG has a lot of strengths of its own, because the HLG is compatible with, so it'll give you HDR on an HDR screen, and it'll give you SDR on an SDR screen from a single file. So HLG has a lot of backwards compatibility, and certainly for a broadcaster that's only able to broadcast one stream of picture information and not able to send the metadata with it, then HLG is a really good solution. But HLG is both a compromise for SDR and for HDR. It doesn't do either as well as it could. So it gives you reasonable HDR and it gives you reasonable SDR. So if you can only send one set of data, HLG is certainly one way to do it. The beauty of the Dolby approach, though, is that you are creating an uncompromised HDR master, and there's no compromises in that HDR whatsoever. And then using this metadata that describes every shot, that is down converted to SDR. And you can go into the metadata. So when you create this metadata package, you can go in on a shot-by-shot basis, look at your monitor in SDR, and adjust the metadata so that it looks great in SDR. So what the Dolby system gives you is uncompromised HDR and uncompromised SDR from a single file. There just aren't as many compromises, because you can tweak each shot to suit whether it's HDR or SDR, but the tweaks are all in the metadata.
So only one file goes out and is sent to a streaming platform or something like that.
Yeah, so Netflix is a prime example of that. So Netflix used the Dolby system, and so on their servers they will have the Dolby master file, and then from that, if somebody connects with an HDR TV, they get the Dolby version for their HDR TV. So if you've got an HLG TV, they get HLG. If they've got an HDR10 TV, they get HDR10. If they've got a Dolby TV, they get Dolby. Which actually, the other thing is, this analysis pass also tells the TV in HDR how to best handle each shot, because there's huge variation in HDR TVs. Some are much better than others. And the Dolby standard actually helps to reduce those differences. So if you've got a shot that might be challenging for an LCD TV but work great on an LED TV, the metadata gives the LCD TV enough information to say, right, so I can't do the blacks as well as an OLED one, right? So what I'm going to do is bring the highlights up, which will increase the contrast. So it will give the blacks the appearance of being darker. So it's a very, very powerful system. And you only have to produce one master for everything, which is just such a time saver. I haven't got to produce SDR and HLG and all the other stuff. And I think it's incredibly powerful.
So we've got a question from Andrew Ho, who's saying, where can we learn more about the Dolby Vision encoding tools? Are they only for the high end?
Well, no, they're not only for the high end. They are built into the studio version of DaVinci Resolve now. You can do it all within Resolve. You do have to have a good quality HDR monitor. That's the biggest challenge. For Dolby, if you're going to create a Dolby master, because so much stuff is going to be changed purely in metadata, if your master isn't good, the metadata is possibly going to make it worse if it's not how it should be. So one of the biggest challenge with producing a Dolby master is about the metadata, is about the monitor that you've got. And that's still a very challenging area, because the good quality HDR monitors are still very, very expensive.
And there's not many.
I mean, no, not many. I mean, the standard one that Dolby tend to recommend is still Sony's X300.
Yep.
There are others as well.
I think Sony have got a new sort of smaller one, haven't they, than the X300?
They've got a couple of smaller. They've got a 17-inch that's just about to be launched, and a 19-inch as well, at a quite good value for money. But jury is still out as to whether I would use those for a Dolby grade. I mean, I've got behind me, there's in here, there's a Atomos Sumo sitting on my desk, which is an HDR monitor, and the TV that's on the wall behind me is a Dolby HDR TV. And between those, I'm able most of the time to get it 99.99% of the way there. And then so I do tend to do the grading here, and then I normally just I'll go somewhere where there is an X300 just for a finishing pass and spend just a couple of hours just basically checking that it is okay.
Sure, so it'd be a post house or something.
Yeah, rather than owning my own X300. I mean, it's something I
No.
may have to get at some point. I'm kind of hoping there might be some cheaper options in the near future.
There's a lot of scope to be cheaper than an X300, but it is a beautiful monitor.
There's plenty. There's some good guidance on Dolby's own website about the workflow and how it works. There's also some good tutorials on various places of how to do it in Resolve, and it's not that difficult. So basically, you have to do what's called is you start off with an HDR10 color grade, which is your standard ST2084 HDR 2020 workflow, and you'll do that normally in ACES in Resolve. So you'll set up an ACES project, do your Rec 2020 HDR10 grade in ACES, and then you run that through an analysis pass within DaVinci Resolve, and the analysis pass produces the metadata, and then you package that up as a file. And if you go to the Netflix website, I don't have the link to hand, but if you look up the production guidelines from Netflix, that gives you a lot of information about how to do it as well, because they actually have a step-by-step guide as to how to do an ACES HDR deliverable.
Those Netflix guidelines are really useful. They're the ones that people talk about them an awful lot from the camera side of things, like which camera is recommended, what camera modes in each camera are recommended for Netflix productions. But they often forget that there's nearly all of those guidelines are to do with post-production rather than the cameras. And so there is a huge amount of information there, which is brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, they don't tell you how to grade, but they tell you the workflow. So between the Netflix documents and between all the online tutorials that there are done by people that are far better colorists than me, there's plenty of information out there on how to produce it, and it's not something to be afraid of. Actually, the first time I thought, oh God, a Dolby project, it seemed really intimidating, and the very first one we did actually. Dolby were involved in themselves because it was for a launch of a new high-end Dolby TV, and of course Dolby wanted to make sure that it looked great on the TV.
It's not intimidating at all.
And I did the grade here, and then we had to go to Dolby in London to finish it, and I went up there and we had a look, and it's like. Basically, the grade was fine. There was no issue with the grade, and there's like, yeah, okay, fine. We'll just do the analysis pass and we'll check that the metadata is all okay, and yeah, it's good.
Great.
So it's not that difficult to do. It's just knowing the steps, really.
Yeah.
And knowing the levels that you need to grade within. That's the key thing. Is that when you do the grade, is that white needs to be 150 nits. Your skin tones need to be 60 to 80 nits down in there, and it's very easy when you're sitting in front of an HDR monitor to not look at your scopes enough and end up grading everything a bit too bright, and then it just doesn't work. So it's just being aware where your levels need to be and things like that, and possibly being just a touch on the conservative side. You don't want to make something that is in your face. Hey, look, this is HDR. Look how bright I can make this, because that's not the point. The point is to make it look good.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of discussion around that actually with HDR. It's a very interesting area. It's about Hollywood, and the sort of stuff that's being done for Netflix and for Amazon Prime, which is all HDR. Is initially there was a lot of pushback from Hollywood saying, "Oh God, we don't want this. We want our films to continue to look like films. We don't want them to be dazzlingly bright in your face and looking like video," until of course there was the sort of realization, well, actually the film doesn't need to look any different at all if that's what you want. Because you just keep it within the SDR part of the HDR range and leave it there for 99% of the film, and then when there is that car crash or that explosion, boom, it goes really dazzlingly bright, and suddenly that shot has so much more impact than it would have done before. Absolutely. So it's using it as a creative storytelling tool instead of a gimmick, just to make pictures brighter.
Yep. Yeah, and your lightning clips are a perfect example of that. It's a perfectly normally graded clip, and then boom, you get a flash of lightning which pings and really jumps out of the.
And yeah, all the stuff that I've shot. Yeah, so shooting on my F5 now, 8 years ago. In fact, I think the first time I went out and shot the storms with the F5 in RAW, that's all HDR content. Even though back then I was only doing SDR with it, I wasn't doing any HDR. So being able to go back through all of that content and lightning and thunderstorms, and actually, interestingly, daytime thunderstorms look really dramatic in HDR. The nighttime ones, because you have so much black, even on SDR, you've got quite good contrast. But when you have a daytime shot with fields and whatever houses, whatever's in the foreground, which are moderately bright, in SDR, the lightning was just a white line down the screen, but then in HDR, it's a brilliant bright flash, and it just looks so much more real, so much more convincing.
Absolutely. It can be a really powerful tool. So Andrew is asking again. He just I know there's other questions out there waiting to get, but since Andrew's are on the Dolby while we're talking about it, he just simply asked, if you're using Final Cut as a non-linear editor, can you just use Resolve for the Dolby Pass? Well, presumably.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes,
absolutely. Yeah, you can do your edit wherever you want. You could use FCP, Premiere, whatever, anything that can output an XML file. So you do your edit. And there's no point in doing any grading at the edit point, because the grade won't transfer to your final output. So you just do your edit in your chosen edit application, Avid, whatever. When your edit's done, you export an XML file, go into Resolve and open the XML file. And Resolve's actually really good now with XML file handling. And generally, it pulls everything in.
It's got the editing side of Resolve there now, which will have helped them massively when doing things like XMLs, because a lot of their functions that it would traditionally be lost via an XML passover. The classic one was always things like crossfades and stuff like that. If you had a crossfade in it, it just wouldn't work. Presumably those are all fine now.
I mean, I do a lot of, not so much now, but I used to be very much a Premiere editor, and bringing in an XML from Premiere, you even get captions, which surprised me. The first time I did, it was like, oh, wow, I wasn't expecting my captions to come in. I mean, they're not quite formatted right, but they're there with the right text and the right fonts, and it's like, oh, okay. And I wasn't expecting that, because they're just they're not actually a file as such. It's just part of the edit data.
Okay, while we're on software, Andrew is asking, is the latest Adobe Premiere understanding HLG sources natively, or do you need to apply an input HLG to Rec 709 lookup table to it?
Well, HLG, in theory, you don't need to have it. You shouldn't need to have a transform, because it exists in the 709 domain, but it does depend on the color space that was used. I don't know the answer to that question, actually, because I'm now editing in Resolve. So I haven't. I know in the last 6 months, Adobe have made some big changes in Premiere with its HDR handling and HDR tools and export. So I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that one.
But really broadly, Premiere will have to be understanding that this is an HLG file somehow, and so if it can't read the metadata, then it can't read that metadata, presumably.
Well, if you're going yes and no, if you're bringing a file into an edit platform in its native format, and you're then going to export it from that platform in the same format, you don't need to do anything to it. I mean, as an example, if your desired output was a slog output, you could bring your slog in. If you don't touch it, it stays as it is. And then you do your editing and everything else, and when you output it, it's still slog. It's only if you then do something to change it, such as grading, adding a LUT or anything else, that it becomes something else. So if you shoot in HLG and you bring it into your edit application and you just edit it and you output it, it's still HLG when it comes out. So it should just pass straight through. The caveat there, and this is something I'm a little bit against personally, is that a lot of the edit applications now are trying to read metadata, and they're trying to do automatic conversions. They're trying to look at how you've got your monitor set, so FCP, as I know, does this now. So if you bring in HDR10 material and you've got an SDR monitor, FCP will show that HDR10 material so that it looks right on your SDR monitor. And a lot of the software now is, and in fact, it's something that Adobe's doing. It's actually one of the reasons why I've shied away from Adobe a little bit, is that I know in Media Encoder now, they're often, you bring in a file in one format, say 709, and you want to produce an H.265 version, and they do an automatic conversion. And sometimes you don't want that. Sometimes you just want, and it's difficult to turn it off. It's like, no, I don't actually want you to do that. I just want you to leave the file as it is and re-encode it.
It's great for people who don't understand HDR at all or really understand what they're working with. But for anyone who does, or anyone's doing it professionally and is consciously doing things, anytime that something like that is automatically changed in the software is problematic.
Yes. A prime example, I'd done something in Resolve, produced a ProRes master. It's an HDR file, and when you have your project set to HDR, so this is one of the nice things about ACES. So when you work in ACES, or if you work in DaVinci's color managed workflow as opposed to their conventional one, when you export something and you've been working in an HDR project, Resolve automatically adds the metadata to the file to say what the file is, or at least the encoding that was used. So I had a ProRes file that was HDR10 that I wanted to take into Media Encoder to make an H.265 file, because at the time Resolve wasn't doing H.265. And Media Encoder just kept converting it back to 709. And it's like, no, just leave it as it is. I don't want you to do that. It is HDR10. I want you just to leave it as HDR10 and just re-encode it. But I couldn't find a way to actually do that, which was very frustrating.
Very frustrating. Okay, so I've got a couple of other questions here which I really want to get onto. But before we do, I just find it interesting while we're talking about formats and Dolby, HLG, all the rest of it. You mentioned that nearly all of your work is in HDR in some form now. What formats are you actually using day to day for your projects, and does it vary depending on your delivery?
There's actually very little difference in my delivery, to be honest. So the workflow is basically to shoot in log or raw. So those of you that know me know I'm a Sony person, so I'm generally shooting, most of what I've done has been F55 and F5, shooting RAW and XOCN, or Venice shooting XOCN. Now I'm using, I've got my own FX9, so I'm shooting S-Log3 on the FX9. But any camera that can shoot log, plus 14 stops dynamic range, that's going to be great. Then you bring the log into your edit system, and then I'm working in DaVinci Resolve using ACES, because ACES, the beauty of ACES is it takes care of all your transforms for you. So you just tell ACES that this was shot on whatever flavor of log that you shot it on. If it's raw, ACES will, in Resolve now, picks up the metadata from the file and will know what you've shot it on. And then you just tell ACES what you need to output. Now, that's generally HDR10. That is by far and away the most commonly used format for HDR. So everything now I'm mastering in HDR10 with 2020 color. So, and that's pretty much everything. If I then need to do SDR versions, one of the nice things, again, is if you're using ACES or a color managed workflow, you just set your output to 709, or you set your output to HLG if that's what you need. And most of the conversion is done for you. You don't have to regrade everything as a rule. There will be a few shots probably that you'll need to tweak, but it's far easier than having to do a complete fresh grade from scratch. So that's my workflow. But one of the things that I'm doing more and more now, though, is for the finished project, because I'm generally doing this with ACES, is I'm saving that as an OpenEXR file. And what that's doing is it's saving the ACES master. So it's not HDR10, it's not HLG, it's not 709, it's not any of those. This is actually the ACES format itself. So it saves it as graded ACES. And the beauty of that is that it means that in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, if there's some new format or new standard, I'll be able to go back to that ACES master, and everything that's in the original with a virtually unlimited dynamic range within ACES is there to produce whatever version you need in the future. And this is in fact the way Netflix like you to do it. And it makes a lot of sense. The downside is that OpenEXR file is huge, because it's very lightly compressed. It's a massive file. But storage isn't expensive, and it is just for the program master.
How massive are we talking compared to like a ProRes export?
A 4 or 5 minute long clip, a video clip, something that I might do for YouTube or something, is 50, 100 gigs, something like that.
100 gig, wow, yeah. Yep. Yeah. So quite a lot bigger. Yeah, probably maybe 4 or 5 times bigger than a normal ProRes.
Generally speaking, it's about 5 times larger than an equivalent ProRes HQ file.
Okay. Hakon is mentioning, you mentioned Dolby Vision, HLG, and HDR10, but where does HDR10 Plus come into this? How is that different from the other flavors?
Yeah. Okay. So Dolby Vision and HDR10 Plus have a lot of similarities. So HDR10 is the parameters that you want to grade within. Then HDR10 Plus is HDR10 with extra metadata. So when you're doing HDR10, you will grade and do an HDR10 grade, and then you go back through your clips on a shot by shot or scene by scene basis and add metadata for each either scene or shot, depending on how complex the edit is. And then that metadata is used by the TV to determine how the clip is displayed. As I said earlier, there's a lot of variation in HDR TVs. If you spend £400 on an HDR TV, it will be an LCD. It'll have a fairly limited HDR range. If you spend £3,000 on one, it's probably going to be either a very, very high-end LCD with area dimming, or a very, very high-quality OLED TV. And they will have a much greater display range than the cheap TV. And as a result, the same clip would normally look very, very different on those two TVs. So the idea behind HDR10 is you add metadata that describes the brightness levels that the clip should look like, and you're kind of describing, this is how I want it to look using metadata, and then the TV takes that metadata and says, well, within the limitations of what I can do, this is the closest to how it's supposed to look. So for each shot, each scene, that metadata is used to allow the TV to adjust to give the best possible image within the capability of the individual TV or monitor. And Dolby does something is very similar. So that's what the Dolby metadata does. So when you create do that analysis pass, and somebody's watching on a Dolby TV at home, is basically doing the similar function. So the metadata is used to allow the TV to optimize its settings to show each clip or each scene in the best possible way. So that's what HDR10 does. And it's all metadata. So it's an HDR10 grade, but with metadata added.
Yeah. Okay. We've got a couple of broader questions now from the beginning of the stream. Blas is asking, he understands that HDR is more info for the highlights, like we described with the lightning bolts there, but isn't it also for shadows and blacks?
Well, actually, no, it's not. Because in Rec 709, black is black. Black is absolute black in Rec 709, and in HDR, black is absolute black as well. There's no difference. And there's a lot of misunderstanding about this, because
I think it's also marketing's fault some of the time.
Yeah, you'll often hear the term blacker blacks, which I always find a highly amusing term, because how can you have black that's blacker than black? Because you can't. Black is black, and black in 709, black in HDR is exactly the same. What people are generally talking about when they talk about better blacks in HDR is actually nothing to do with the camera that you shot it on, or the way you've encoded it, or any of those things. It's just simply that a good quality HDR TV will be able to show blacks better than your run-of-the-mill average SDR TV, and
So
that's generally speaking. Yeah, go on.
Well, just to play devil's advocate, I mean, if for the average Joe Blog sitting at home with his TV, say me, for example, in my living room, I have a probably, I don't know, £500. It was an HDR TV back when HDR first came out, but it wasn't expensive one at all. It was about a £500 one. It's not HDR TV, but it's perfectly nice Panasonic panel. So if I upgraded to a £3,000 HDR TV now, I would get blacker blacks because the TV panel would be significantly better. It would be a QLED or an OLED or something like that, which will actually be showing proper black rather than my current TV, which can't reach those black levels. There would still be some light bleed there. So I guess that's where the TV manufacturers are coming from. But I guess the key bit that people need to understand is that it's not something that's inherent with this change from SDR to HDR as a technology for us as video professionals to talk about.
Yeah, indeed. And if you think about that as well, if you've bought that £2,000, £3,000 HDR TV and you watch SDR on it, your SDR blacks are going to be fabulous.
Still be blacker.
SDR blacks will be the same for HDR blacks. So it is about the panel, the TV. I mean, the main thing is for a very long time we've used LCD TVs now. And if you ever look at your LCD TV, unless you are lucky enough to have a really, really good one, and you watch a letterboxed movie, and then if you turn the lights out in your room and watch a letterboxed movie, are the black bars actually black?
That is a very good way to test it.
No, they're almost always very, very slightly grey. Or even if you just have a black screen. If you have a black screen and you turn all the lights out in your room, that TV, in most cases, is actually still putting out rather a lot of light because LCDs leak light through them. So new technologies have come along now where the backlight that illuminates behind the LCD either works in zones or areas, so it's actually turned off where it's not needed, or you have OLED, which where it's black, there's no light output whatsoever, so you get much better looking blacks. But it's all about the display technology rather than HDR per se, because black is black whether it's SDR or HDR, so it's better quality TV. I mean, which it shouldn't be a surprise really that a better quality TV can produce a better looking image than a cheaper TV.
Okay, another broader one from Video Editor Bloke, which by the way is a fantastic name. Has your shooting style changed since switching to HDR filming? I'm assuming he doesn't mean just generically. We get the question a lot, do you need to change how you're filming in order to produce HDR content? Which I guess we can touch on very quickly in case other people are thinking the same thing. But I guess he's asking more specifically, has your shooting style changed?
Not really. No. Very, very, very little change. All the same rules apply, exposure, etc. Which are, yes, that's all the same. I suppose the only things that have changed now is I'm monitoring in HDR. So I use an HDR monitor, so I can actually see my full range, and I find that incredibly useful.
You mean actually while shooting an on-camera monitor?
Yeah. Yes. At the moment, there are no HDR viewfinders, and I'm not sure you want an HDR viewfinder because it would be quite uncomfortable to watch. If it's an enclosed viewfinder and that viewfinder is suddenly, you're shooting that sunset shot and the sunset in the viewfinder is dazzlingly bright, that's not going to be very pleasant to use. There's a lot of debate as to how useful HDR viewfinders will be, but certainly an HDR monitor is very useful. Now I'm actually able to see what's going on in my highlights instead of guessing. So in the past we would shoot something with a camera that's got 14 stops of dynamic range. You put a LUT on it, and you're looking at a very small part of the range that the camera is actually capturing, and you're trying to guess what the highlights actually look like. Is it overexposed or is it not? And you're sort of looking at thinking, I think it's all right, and you shoot. But with an HDR monitor, you can actually see what those highlights are doing much more clearly. Gives you the confidence that they are or are not clipped or whatever. So that's the one big change really, is using HDR monitor.
And which HDR monitor are you using?
So at the moment I'm using Shogun 7, Atomos Shogun 7. I think it's a great device. It's quite heavy actually. So either
It
Shogun
suffers
7
from the same problem as most Atomos recorders, is because they're recorders and monitors at the same time. They have to have the batteries on one side and a media slot on the other, so they tend to be fairly heavy but also lopsided.
Well, I run a DTAP off the camera batteries for the monitor, so
yes, that helps a lot.
That helps a lot. Or if I'm using the FS5, or if I just want a monitor and I don't need the recorder, I've got the Ninja 5. So which is actually, I really like the Ninja 5. It's a great little monitor. It weighs very, very little, small, compact, lovely little screen. I think it's a great device. But I'm now sort of starting to think about, with the FX9 and version 2 firmware coming, that I'll be shooting RAW with that come August or whenever that October, whenever it comes.
For that. Yep.
Yeah, and that's got to be the Shogun 7. So I've been looking at, in fact, actually behind me here. I don't think Carl can go to full screen. Make Carl do some work. No, it's a bit dark. I have my FX9 with the Shogun 7 on it behind me.
Yeah.
But in terms of things like, shooting an interview and there's a bright window behind the person that you're interviewing, you would think, it's HDR, that'll look great and everything else. But actually, the reality is very often, no, it doesn't look great. It becomes distracting.
Yeah, again, whenever I've heard proper colorists give presentations on how they're using HDR, they spend so much of their time talking about distractions and how to draw people's attention. And when you want to draw someone's attention to a highlight and when you don't. And yeah, in that example, in an interview, the last thing you want people doing is being blinded by the window behind them. You want them to pay attention to the face.
Yeah, so if this was an HDR stream right now, I would still have your blinds closed behind you for exactly the same reason. So you still have to think about all the same old things. Do I need to put ND or a mesh or scrim or something over a window to bring that level down? Because we don't, the whole HDR isn't about creating a statement that, look, I shot this in HDR, so I can make this really bright. It's about making pictures that look nice and are enjoyable to watch still. So Absolutely. All of the old rules are still there. Everything still applies. Nothing changes.
And so again, to use this stream as an example, there would be literally no need or reason to do this stream in HDR because
it wouldn't look any different.
Yeah, it wouldn't look any different. What frame in here would be HDR? What would be a brighter highlight? There wouldn't be one.
Yeah, except maybe the highlight on my forehead here.
Which we probably don't want.
Yeah, exactly. And so makeup is important. Actually, I mean, one thing that does change a little bit with HDR is because there is the potential to have more contrast, because hopefully people that are going to watch this on those higher quality TVs, is that you do have to watch for noise. Because one of the things is if you can reproduce the blacks and the shadows better, if that TV can show those really dark areas of the picture that much better, it will also show the noise that's in those dark parts of the picture that much better. So that you do have to be a little bit careful about noise and things like that. So, just something to watch for, but you'd have done that anyway. So I think it's a little bit, I think I'd take a little bit more care over exposure. I think I concentrate a little bit more on what's going on in my shadows and things like that, because I know that people with the decent quality TVs will be able to see that more. So a bit more effort into making the shadow areas of the shot nicer. But overall, there's very little difference in the way I shoot with HDR compared to anything else.
Right. So one last question, which I just want to get to, is from JOS Fenson. Who says, do you have any idea about the conformity of HLG profiles across different camera manufacturers? So the example he gives is if he shoots HLG B2020 on a Sony, will it match HLG from a Panasonic? And he says, does that mean that you never get any problems matching cameras anymore? We have then had a reply from James Jackson Films who just says, I don't think that'll be the case because cameras' color science will still be a factor, even if they're using the same picture profile. And I guess you've got to keep in mind, if you were shot in normal Rec 709 mode, so not log, not Cinegammas or anything of this stuff, just ordinary Rec 709 profile on a Panasonic, a Canon and a Sony of different camera brands, would they look the same? No,
they'll look
probably not.
Similar. HLG is a bit of a minefield at the moment because there's actually a bit of an argument going on at the moment between the two main proponents in the development of HLG were the BBC and then NHK in Japan. And the original HLG standard, I can't remember the exact number, actually put white at about 55-60%, and then the BBC sort of said no, that's way too dark, our audience won't accept that, we need to have white at about 70-75%. And if you consider that Rec 709 is typically 85-90%, you'll see that even that's relatively speaking dark.
Well, that would dramatically change everything. If you, again, to use this stream as an example, we have a white background around us right now. Imagine if that was at 50%, it would be great. It wouldn't be white.
But there is now there's all sorts of arguments going on between the BBC and NHK when they're trying to standardize HLG, and they can't agree. So at the moment there are sort of standards for HLG, which generally tends to be following the BBC standard at the moment, but it's all a bit up in the air. And the camera manufacturers, and the same happens with 709, to be honest, is the camera manufacturers, they all interpret it differently. I mean, when you try and define what is Rec 709, there is a formula that you can apply for a display that says, well, this brightness should be, or this level should be this brightness, etc. But camera manufacturers still want to make their cameras look nicer than the other camera manufacturers. So they all fiddle around with it to some degree to try and make it look nicer in their camera. So it's very rare to find cameras that actually have the same gamma in them. Now, on the Sony cameras, if you go in their more recent cameras to the standard gammas, and you'll see that there's some BBC gammas in there. You'll see that there's I can't remember what they call this. Your standard 1 through 6, and in amongst those, there's a couple of those are based on a couple of different BBC gamma curves for 709. But even that should tell you that, well, hang on a minute. If the BBC have more than one gamma curve for Rec 709, what is Rec 709? And ultimately, ultimately Rec 709 is just about creating a signal that comes out of the camera or your edit suite that looks nice on a Rec 709 TV. And if you grade something, arguably it's not Rec 709. You've made something that's Alister Chapman 09 or whatever, but it just happens to look nice on a 709 TV. It's like if you take S-Log and you show it on a 709 TV, it looks flat and washed out. And some people love that. And if that's the look they want, arguably that's 709. Or at least 709 compatible, because if that's the look that they want, it's no different to grading something for that look. So coming back to the original question of different HLGs across different cameras, they do vary a lot. They're broadly similar because they're all broadly trying to achieve the same thing, but they vary. And it's actually very challenging with HLG because if you look at the Sony cameras as an example, they actually have 3 different HLG curves depending on the light levels that you're shooting in. Because one of the things you want to try and do with HLG if you're capturing it is to match the curve to the capture range of the camera. So different cameras with different dynamic ranges are going to have very slightly different variations of HLG to tailor it for that camera. I mean, the thing is, HLG was never meant to be a capture format. It was meant to be a delivery format. So the idea would be there would be one HLG curve, just as there is one 709 curve in TVs, and then you adjust the cameras to make pretty pictures. And that's how it's supposed to be used. But of course, it's become now, well, let's put the HLG in the camera for this, what tends to be called an instant HDR workflow. Shoot, deliver, that's it, don't need to grade it. But because you don't grade it, it's really important that what you shoot is appropriate for the light levels that you're using. So Sony have 3 different HLG curves to suit different light conditions, because the one that works really well...
Curves developed by Sony, right?
Yes, they're developed by Sony. They follow broadly the HLG specification, broadly follow the BBC HLG specification, but Sony felt they actually needed to provide the end user with 3 different versions of that curve, one for shooting in highlight situations, which then favors brighter scenes, which is, I've got to get this the right way around, which is HLG 3.
Yeah.
And then one that favors shooting in a lower light situation that favors the shadow areas so that the shadows don't look murky and too dark. And that's, I think, HLG 1. I might have that the wrong way around.
Yeah, it's a minefield.
But because you're doing it in camera, and HLG is actually really difficult to grade, it's better to do it as you shoot it rather than then trying to grade HLG. If you really want to produce the best HDR, shoot in log and grade that and produce the HLG from that. But if you're going to try and shoot HLG in the camera, you've got to match the curve to what you're shooting.
Okay, so we've got a couple of questions I just want to try and get to before we wrap up at the end. Just a quick one. Stevie says, technical question, assuming he has DaVinci Resolve Studio and an HDR display, does he need anything else to grade for HDR? No.
Nope. No.
That's all you need. Just be careful what you mean by an HDR display, because unless you're going to spend 20 grand on an X300, you don't get a HDR standard display.
There are some considerations. So one of those is what sort of HDR display. If it's an HDR TV, you may find that you need to send the metadata to the TV to make the TV go into the right HDR mode.
Yeah.
So to get that to work properly, you're going to have a proper video card in the computer. Okay. And by that I mean not just the VGA card that the computer has, but a Blackmagic Decklink or similar card in the computer. Because what you then do is within Resolve, you'll set up an HDR project, whether that's using HDR Color Managed or ACES, and then you tell Resolve to send the HDR metadata to the monitor.
And an external one would work as well, right? Like the Blackmagic Mini Monitor 4K, for example.
Yeah. Yes, that's right. Yes.
But not the little one, the Mini Monitor. The Mini Monitor, I don't think can do HDR.
No, the regular Mini Monitor doesn't. You have to have the slightly bigger one, the 4K to embed metadata. But that's not all TVs. Some TVs you can do it manually. You can go into the TV setting and turn it to HDR. Using a professional HDR monitor, you just set the monitor to the HDR mode and that becomes less of a problem. But even there, I would really highly, highly recommend that you have a proper dedicated video card to send the signal to the monitor. HDR is very unforgiving of things not being the right bit depth and stuff like that. And very often, if you just take the HDMI out from your computer to an HDR monitor, you get banding and other artifacts, and you might be looking at it and thinking, oh my god, this is terrible, my footage is broken, what's wrong? Only to find out that if you'd actually come out via a proper video card, your Blackmagic card or whatever, all those problems aren't there. Yeah. So it's something to be aware of, at least. And I really would recommend anybody that's serious about doing any video editing, whether it's SDR or HDR, to have a proper pipeline for your monitoring.
And that Blackmagic Mini Monitor 4K is a great place to start.
Yeah.
Okay, so the last question I wanted to get to, which I think is a really good question to finish on. Andre is asking, what is the future for HDR? It was 3D Blu-rays and TVs, and now that's gone. Can that happen to HDR as well? Basically, is HDR a fad, or is it here to stay? And if it is here to stay, what might it look like?
HDR is here to stay. HDR won't go anywhere. 3D keeps coming up against this challenge of having to wear glasses. And from a shooting point of view, it's technically very, very difficult to actually video or shoot in 3D. I mean, I did it for quite a few years. I developed 3D camera systems and all sorts. And shooting live action 3D is very, very challenging. Not impossible. 3D animation now is really easy, and the ability to turn a 2D movie into 3D using computer processes now is really very, very good. But the big issue is people don't want to wear 3D glasses to watch TV or go to a cinema. Some people get headaches from it. And that makes it a challenge. And for that reason, and I think for that reason alone, actually, it's struggled, and it will always struggle. Maybe one day somebody will come out with a display technology that allows you to sit in your living room just as you do now, to lie down in your bed or on your side on the sofa, however you want to watch it, and watch it in 3D. and then maybe 3D will come back then and stay. HDR is here to stay because you don't have to do anything special to watch it other than have a high quality or an HDR TV. Give it another couple of years, and I don't think you'll actually be able to buy a TV that is just SDR. All TVs will eventually, and all our devices will eventually become capable of doing it. And there's no penalty to HDR. 3D
this is a big thing.
Meant a lot of extra work, meant a lot of extra everything, but HDR doesn't. It's just, it will become normal eventually. You will just shoot in HDR and you'll deliver in HDR just as we shoot in SDR and deliver in SDR now.
And there was a lot of compromises that had to be made with 3D across the boards, both in terms of how much kit, like you say, is needed. It changes the production massively. Also in terms of the final image,
massively.
It would make the entire screen darker in most cases, or at least it wouldn't make the screen darker, but having glasses on would make it darker. All these sorts of things. There was lots of image quality and production compromises that had to be made with 3D. Whereas, as you said earlier on, HDR, you can have an HDR production all the way it goes through, and then the final output looks no different from an SDR production. There's no compromises. It's only ever potential gains.
I mean, I'd love to have a time machine because I'd love to go 20 years forward, because I'm quite sure in 20 years' time, the TV crews of the day and everything will be looking back at the days of SDR and thinking, how the hell did they manage to do that?
Yeah.
How on earth did they manage to shoot a bright outdoor sunny day scene and show it with a screen that could only show a fraction of what you captured?
Yeah.
And I think that's what will...
Our perception of what those should look like on the TV will change. I think in the same way as we go back now and look at standard definition, like take any production, even the most amazing ones, like the original Blue Planet, for example, we went back and watched a couple of months ago, and it looks dated now. Because of the resolution on it. In the same way as we now do that, I think people.
This has always been one of the. Yeah, this has always been one of the advantages of film is that 35mm film. Upscales beautifully, and they've always captured all those details and textures. But if you go back and you say standard definition television, I look at it now and I think, oh my God, what were we thinking? I mean, you look at a VHS tape or something like that, and it's just like, how did we do that? Why did we do that? And I think that's, HDR will become normal. I mean, HDR opens up a whole world of possibilities. I mean, we're on that verge now of that. You've seen it so many times in science fiction films of having a wall in your room, in your house, that is a TV screen, and it looks like you're looking outside. And there was a lot of argument to say when 3D was the thing, that it was 3D that would be needed to make that. But the reality was actually that while the 3D gives it depth, because it didn't have the contrast, it didn't have the brightness, it didn't have all the other things, it was never ever really going to look truly real. With HDR, because one of the biggest cues that a human being has actually for depth is contrast.
Yeah.
So when you have really good contrast, you actually get depth cues. Mm-hmm. So you can have that big wall now in your house with amazing contrast, where if it's that desert island beach, you want to make yourself think you're somewhere beautiful when you wake up in the morning.
It'd be quite nice right now, wouldn't it?
Yeah, the water will sparkle. The water, will look real. It won't look like. I mean, SDR really struggles to make water look real. Yeah. You look at water on an SDR screen, and it's grey. It's never sparkly. It just doesn't have that sparkle.
Think of that now. Well, we can watch a TV film that's shot in normal SDR for years and years and years, and water just looks fine. It just looks like water. Okay, whatever. But I think once we get used to the way that things like that look in HDR from a TV point of view, and how much more realistic that is, I think we will that our brains will just tune to that being the normal.
Oh, I mean, I had an OLED, a brand new state of the art, I think about £4,000 OLED TV on loan for a while. An absolutely stunning dynamic range on that set. And I had it in the living room. I was supposed to be using it in the grading suite, but in the evenings it got taken off the wall and went into the living room so we could watch stuff on the TV in the evenings. And then when the client says, well, we need it back now, and I put my normal SDR TV back in, normal HDR TV, it's just like, oh God, I'm not going to be able to watch it. Yeah. So I think it will become normal and it won't go away. Because actually, to be honest, I think once everything is HDR and the workflows and everyone understands it and knows it, it's actually going to be easier perhaps than things are now in many respects, because you're not trying to squeeze everything into a silly restricted dynamic range.
Yep. It'll be easier, it will be better, and there won't be any compromises. So why would it not be the way that the industry is going to go?
We've got a bit of a way to go before we get there, though.
We're not there yet.
No, not yet.
Right, I think that is a absolutely fantastic place to wrap it up. I think that's been really useful. Hopefully everyone who's been watching this has found that useful. Thank you so much, Alister, for all your time and expertise on this.
Stay safe, everyone.
Absolutely. Stay safe, everyone. So for those watching, please do come back and join us tomorrow. We're joined by Philip Bloom. Tomorrow we're going to be running over some of the new releases from the last couple of weeks, talking about cameras such as the Kinfinity Mavro Edge, the Canon C300 Mark III, even things like the Fuji X-T4, and along with some of the firmware updates that have come along, like the FX9's firmware update, for example. So we're just going to be doing a bit of a roundup as to what's new and what to look out for. And that'll be tomorrow at 2:00. So please do come join us for now. But for the meantime, thank you so much, Alister.
You're welcome. Have a good week, everyone.
Absolutely. Take care, everyone.
XS Wireless Digital is the perfect wireless audio solution for content creators and filmmakers. Thanks to a 2.4 GHz transmission, XS Wireless Digital is a truly plug-and-play system that allows you to upgrade your in-camera audio with one-button operation. With a variety of configurations to choose from, this entry point into the world of wireless will improve your workflow and will expand the possibilities of how you capture audio for your video. For more information, visit sennheiser.com/XSWD. The MKE600 is a shotgun microphone ideal for professional video camera applications. Maximal rejection of ambient side noises thanks to pronounced directivity. And because the MKE600 has a very good suppression of structure-borne noise, it makes one of the most versatile all-round shotgun microphones on the market. XS Wireless Digital is the perfect wireless audio solution for content creators and filmmakers. Thanks to a 2.4 GHz transmission, XS Wireless Digital is a truly plug-and-play system that allows you to upgrade your in-camera audio with one-button operation. With a variety of configurations to choose from, this entry point into the world of wireless will improve your workflow and will expand the possibilities of how you capture audio for your video. For more information, visit sennheiser.com/XSW.